John 17:17 says God's word is truth. Not the truth, it is truth. So truth is whatever God says. We've just come through Christmas, and we're now in the kind of the aftermath of Christmas, which is cleaning up, returning things, and all that stuff. And so much of Christmas has been about stuff, things. Did we get the right present? Did I give the right present? Did this fit? Does that not do? And we get so uptight over things. And what happens is the more we think about those things, the more we focus on those things, the more our heart begins to be given to those things. And Jesus goes on to say, he's not saying we shouldn't have those things. What he says is, here's the lesson. And of course, it's the verse we know so well, Matthew 6:33. Therefore, seek you first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all the things you need will be added unto you. So Jesus is talking about the priorities of our heart, where our motive is seeking him. He says, if you seek him, then all the things you need will be added unto you. I get this image sometimes that God has his hands full of things. And it's kind of like the children around the Christmas tree, taking the presents. And God, I need this, and God, I need this, and Aunt Susie needs this, and da-da-da-da-da. And God's blessing and handing things out. And at some point he's saying, how about me? I've given me. In our natural, unrenewed mind, and we wouldn't dare say this in church, but I'll say it for us. Well, but what can you do for me? I mean, I need the things that what do I get from you, from having a relationship with you? But if we really knew what comes from having him, all the rest of these things would just kind of pale away in insignificance. Now let's go over to John 15, because this really does fit within our study. John 15, Jesus is continuing to talk to them about preparing them for him to go. And he says in the beginning, verse 1, I am the true vine, my Father is the vine dresser. We talked about that last time. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. That word also means lift up. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. You are already clean because of the word that I've spoken to you. And here, look at this. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, and you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit, for without me or apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone abides in me, he is cast out as a branch and is withered, and they gather them and throw them into the fire, and they're burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, you will ask what you desire, and it will be done unto you. This fits in with this astonishing promise he made over in verse 13 of chapter 14. We said, if you keep my commandments, my Father and I will come, and we will abide in you. The writer John is really the only one that in this sense uses this word abide. It's the Greek word meno, M-E-N-O, which literally means to reside in, to remain in. And I was meditating on that. What does that word mean? Because he's telling us to abide in him. And then I realized I have a place of abode. It's my house. What do I do when I abide in my house? I live there. It's where my things are. Whatever is of value, I keep there because I know it's safe there. I may go out and run errands, and I may go to work, but I always come back to my home. It's where I'm safe, it's where I'm comfortable, and it's my house. We travel on trips, we've been on mission trips, we've been in other parts of the world and come back, but it's always good when you come home because it's my home. There's nothing like my bed. All right? I've slept in more comfortable beds, but this is my bed. Got the little, it's me, it's my bed. It's my house, it's my chair. It's just it's where I belong. And what Jesus is saying is, because you have come to me, there's a new place of abode for you. and there's a new place where I'm going to abide. My place where I'm now comfortable and at home is in you. Now, we hear this, we've heard this to some degree before, but you've got to understand what this must have sounded like to a Jew in that day and age. Because the God they knew of was a God of judgment. The God they knew of was a God of the law. The God they knew of was a God who dwelt in heaven. Of course, that's where most people think God dwells today anyway. That's where many Christians think he dwells. If you look back in the Old Testament, you'll see in Genesis, and we've looked back in our study and seen some of it there, but if you really step back as you read that story, you'll see a picture of God creating this man in order to be with him. In chapter 3, after Adam and Eve have broken God's commandment, God comes down to walk with them in the cool of the evening, of the garden in the evening, and you almost sense that this was a regular practice, that God walked with him and spent time with him and enjoyed being with him, and they enjoyed being with him. And now because of the sin, that fellowship has been separated. There's a breach there that they can't cover over, and that breach is sin because God is a righteous, holy being. And everything else in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, is God laying out his design to restore that relationship, that place of relationship with man again. God calls a man named Abram, living in a very pagan society, which is where Iraq is located now. God calls this man and reveals himself to him. Up until this point, this man's just worshiped the moon. And the moon never talked to him, at least I assume it didn't. And now there's a God that's speaking to him and calling him and giving him a purpose and telling him to leave his family, to leave his home, and to go, and he will tell him where that place is when they get there. And God's plan is to take a man, Abram, and out of this man to form a people with whom God would have a very special relationship, unlike his relationship with every other nation on the earth up until that time or after that time. That God would enter into a covenant, a blood covenant with this nation through this man. And that's exactly what God did. And the purpose of that covenant was it was a legal way that God could give himself to that people. And God did that. He gave himself to them. Even the story of how they ended up in Egypt is a living out of that covenant relationship because there was a famine coming in the land where God's people dwelt. And God, to prepare them for the famine, sent Joseph ahead. Joseph didn't understand why he went up until that point, not until later on. But Joseph, through a whole series of events, which really was using his brother's sin, positioned Joseph so that at the time the famine hit, their own brother would be handling the famine relief program in Egypt. So that when it was time, God could bring his covenant people under the umbrella and protection of this biggest nation of the world, and that nation would feed them. And that's exactly what happened. God was providing for them. What happened is they overstayed their need to be there. And when they finally get desperate in living under this tremendous oppression that they're under, they cry out to God, their God whom they had this covenant with, whom they'd forgotten. He never forgot the covenant, but they cried out to this God for their deliverance, and he heard their cry. But because he had a covenant with them and he belonged to them and they belonged to him, he already had the deliverer prepared 80 years into his preparation, Moses. So when they cried out for their deliverer was prepared. And God sent Moses to them, and through the supernatural display of power, God delivers his people. And even the instructions that he gave to Moses to tell to Pharaoh why God was delivering them. He said, Jehovah has said to tell you to let my people go. And this is the key most people forget. That they may go out into the wilderness and worship him. So that one verse in there says that on that third day, oh, I love this. Moses brought the people out to meet their God. Last August, we had the privilege of going down to be with our daughter when she had her second child, and I'm just thinking of the time when, they go through all the stuff after the delivery and clean them up and test the test and everything out. And then there's that moment when they bring the baby into the mother's room and says, here's your daughter. Here's your daughter. You've been carrying her for 9 months in your womb. You've been imagining what she looks like, and nowadays, of course, with the ultrasounds, you can see some pictures, but you don't know hair color, you don't know all that. You've been carrying them around inside of you, and now you've given birth, and here's your daughter. That's kind of what I sense. It's like God's going through all of this, and he's come down on this mountain. And Moses says, I'm going to bring you out to meet your God who delivered you, who loves you. And they came out around the base of the mountain, and they couldn't handle God and his power. And so they pulled away, and they said to Moses, no, we can't handle this. You go talk to him and tell us what he said. And they pulled away. God pulled Moses up on the mountain again, and God said, I'm giving you supernatural drawing plans because I want you to construct something for me. I want you to construct a tent. And I want you to construct, and you're going to call it a tabernacle. Tabernacle just means a dwelling place. You're going to construct this. And I want you to design it with exactly all these specifications. There's a book in the bookstore I wrote called the Tabernacle of Moses in the Wilderness, or Why Study an Old Tent. And it goes through this and why God did this and what these different parts were. But he gave Moses very detailed instructions. And then when they'd finished constructing this beautiful tent and the courtyard around it, and everything in there has a significance legally so that God could do what he wanted to do. And at the moment that this tent was dedicated, it says God came down to reside in the innermost tent called the Holy of Holies, to reside above the gold cherubim sitting on the mercy seat. And all of that has significance of why God could now come in his presence and be there among them. And what it is the heart of a creator who said, I'm not satisfied living in heaven, watching you come and go. I want to be among you. I want to be with you. I don't want to be a distant God and creator. I want to be with you, and this is the closest I can get because of where you are right now. But I'm training you and preparing you for something. And then, of course, generations come and go. They didn't understand all that. They didn't understand what they had. All they knew is this God led them through the wilderness. And this God defeated their enemies. That's really all they knew. He was among them, but they didn't know what he was like. They couldn't have him, and he couldn't have them. And then the Bible tells us there's this period of about 400 years of silence. And then the silence is broken with angelic beings. And we see this in Matthew's account of the birth of Christ. And we see this in what I talked about on Christmas Eve in John's account. And one of the most powerful verses in the Bible to me is John 1:14. And the Word became flesh. And the Greek word says, and tabernacled among us. Now we have God, not restricted to living in a tent made with materials that man had put together. He had to do that because the tent had to represent holiness. But now God had sent his own Son to dwell in flesh, and he had to be holy. But now you've got God dwelling among his people, not in a gold tent, but in human flesh. And now God could reach out and touch us.